Hey everyone, this is Kieran from Eccentric Physio. Today we're looking at a couple variations on building some hip internal rotation and external rotation in a quadruped position. So basically I'm going to be on my hands and knees and I'm going to be moving through some hip ranges. It's a nice deloaded way to start getting some end range movements into your hip. It can be a stretch for some, it can be a strengthening exercise for some. It really depends on what your individual limitation is. But I recommend it as a general warm-up anyway for your hips in the early stages of rehab. So if this sounds like something unfamiliar to you, give it a go. If it's easy, then you can progress on to other stuff. Quadruped position is a position that we use to mobilize as kids. So it enables us to take weight and get our limbs to start coordinating together so that we can crawl. It's also something that prepares us to be able to take load through our hip joints, particularly with the forces going in an antero-posterior, so from front to back. It's going to help with loading our bones as well, and it's also going to help with developing some ranges through our hip, or control of ranges, which is something that we do more of as a kid. We've already kind of got the flexibility. But if you're coming from the other end of the spectrum where you've lost flexibility and you're trying to regain it, this is a nice exercise to start doing that, because you're going to be getting a reflexive stability just because you've got other contact points on the ground. And there's enough contact points that your body's just probably going to give you a little more flexibility than if you tried to do it just squatting. So from the side, it looks like this. From the front, it looks like this. So what's the difference at the moment between this and the quadruped rocking exercise we've got? The difference is just in what we're going to do with our knees to bias that internal rotation, external rotation. So in the other exercise is a little bit more about priming for that squat or that takeoff in the crawl. This is a little bit more about just biasing some certain restrictions that you might have in your hips. So if my knees are outside of my hands like this and my feet are closer together, now I'm in an externally rotated position at the hip. If I switch them around and my feet are out here and my knees are in, now I'm in an internally rotated position. So you can start there and then you can challenge the ability to stay there as you go forward and back or side to side. So if I went into my externally rotated position and I sat down, I can say for me quite comfortably I've got full range there because I can contact where I want to be. From the side, I can sit back and come back up, sit back and up, and I'm working on that flexibility. Because I'm trying to bias it to my hips, I'm not letting any movement happen here. If movement does happen there, that's fine. It just means you're creating movement there and not all the movement at the hip. So it really depends on what your focus is. Now, for the internally rotated focused one, I'm going to go knees in a little bit and feet out a bit, and again, sit back. Now there's less rotation here, particularly for me and some of my injuries, but generally as well, in the shape of your hip socket and the direction it faces, as well as how big your, not how big necessarily, but the direction that your neck of your femur faces as well, and how all that stuff interfaces is gonna dictate how much external rotation, internal rotation you have along that arc. And that'll change your ability to get your knees close and get far down into hip flexion versus someone else who can maybe get further into hip flexion by externally rotating. Some of that's cultural, not cultural, sorry, but where you're from on our earth. But for me, if I go into internal rotation and try and sit down, I hit a block. That's as far as I can go. From here, I hit a block. And that block doesn't feel muscular. It's not like I'm feeling a stretch in my external rotations out here. I'm getting an impingement feel. So it's not something I have to go and push into. So if you're getting a restriction in this area, I would just stop and don't push that further. You can go a little bit and back off, a little bit back off, but it's not something that you need to improve because you're probably running into just bony impingement. Now you could sort of alternate the legs. So now I've got one externally rotated, one internally rotated. If I sit back into my right leg, a little more external rotation. Again, if I sit back into my left, I can't because of that block. If I switch the legs, now I can go down into my left hip. If I go over to the right, And interestingly, my right one has a little bit more range and internal rotation than my left. And my left hip is the one that's had the injury in the past. So now I've picked up a one-sided difference. I could probably work a little bit on the internal rotation on this side because I know that this side has got a little bit more. Yes, the hips could be a little bit different from each other because of the injury history, but something to consider. So give these a go. It's a nice way to just start introducing those movements. Rock back and forth for like a minute or two. Should be pain-free. Should feel afterwards like the hips have opened up a little bit. And then this might be a nice warm-up for, say, a squat day or anything lower limb movement. If you like this video, then please hit like below. Otherwise, to check out more of our content in the future, you can subscribe to our channel by clicking our logo over here. And to check out our latest video, click up here.